A word of warning, this podcast explores graphic and disturbing stories and includes some strong language. It therefore may not be suitable for our young listeners or other folks who may find it disturbing. Hello and welcome to True Crime News, the podcast covering high-profile and under-the-radar cases from across the country every week. I'm your host, Ana Garcia. All right, the case this week, it has been dubbed the Black Swan murder. A former ballerina claims that she shot her estranged husband in self-defense. However, the prosecution says that the wife was not the victim here, that she was trying to get rid of her husband. This was cold blood because they were in the middle of a custody battle over their baby. So, which is it? Self-defense or is it murder? Well, the verdict is in, and the jury says guilty of manslaughter. We are recording this on Wednesday, July 31st of 2024. Our guest today is Phillip Hamilton, a criminal defense attorney, managing partner at Hamilton Clark LLP, dear friend of the show, and honestly, Phillip, you're the only one brave enough to come into the studio, which I love.
Right around the corner from the office, you're here. You put those two things together. I mean, we know what that equation equals.
We are so happy to have you. You really are a fan favorite. People love to hear you because you're so common sense and you've got compassion. And it's, you explain these cases to us. So we're thrilled to have you. And we got quite a case for you.
We are actually in person. There's
oh
no
my God.
screen, no Zoom.
I know.
We're here.
Human touch.
So.
All right, Phillip, let's get to it. This case straddles both Charleston, South Carolina, and Manatee County, Florida, where the former ballerina was charged with killing her husband. Okay, here's what we're dealing with. The wife is 32-year-old Ashley Benefield. Now, she had admitted to shooting her husband, Doug, who was much older. He was 58 years old, Doug Benefield. So the shooting part was never in dispute from the moment the cops were called through being charged, through trial. She said it was in self-defense. But no one seemed to buy that.
I mean, as of yesterday, it's clear, right? The jury has spoken. I was talking a little bit before we came on. Just to be frank, I was a little surprised. Only because, a lot of times in these cases, even if you don't full out plead, battered woman syndrome, there were a lot of those kind of underlying facts that arose in this matter. Like, for instance, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, just some allegations from when Doug, so to speak, had shot into the ceiling at one point when he got really upset with her, a couple of days prior, I think, to them actually getting married. I'm just saying, when you have things like that and you're presenting in a way that could somehow or another give reasonable belief that maybe you were in fear for your life or that this person is someone that's volatile or what have you, these cases, they're always toss-ups, right? So when I say I'm surprised, it's not so much that even there was a conviction as much as that there just wasn't a mistrial, right? Or a hung jury or something like that. But, the jury found it clear, and I guess we'll talk about why.
I think for me, what was overwhelming was the medical examiner's report saying that when Doug was shot, he was not facing her, which I guess is another way of saying, I don't know if his back was turned to her. But that, to me, did not line up with her testimony, that really teary-eyed, crying on the stand testimony. Her body's quivering. If it was self-defense, and we're going to play the testimony for you, does that line up for you?
It's tough. All right, it makes it a little bit harder, I would say, to walk away with that self-defense type of acquittal. It's not impossible. We've had cases, and again, it typically involves, I'm just going to be frank here when I think about those situations, but cases we've dealt with where, women were alleged to have violently assaulted either a bigger man or a man that's known to have volatility issues or even a criminal record, right? And even such that maybe, the shooting, we've had one of those actually occurred where the man was in the process of turning away, ended up getting shot in the back. If you can put a compelling narrative out, you will have situations at times where juries will still find, even if in light of the coroner's report that he wasn't shot in a way where he's facing directly at her or coming at her, the narratives at times still can be enough to get an acquittal or at least a hung jury. So, for them to, again, have come to such a clear verdict and kind of a relatively short period of time, it was just a little bit surprising to me.
Yeah, it was something like less than 7 hours
Yeah.
that they deliberated. So, like I said, they just did not believe her weepy
Right.
story on the stand. For those of us, who are following this, the jury verdict actually came in on Tuesday, July 30th. That was yesterday. And they found her guilty of manslaughter, even though she was originally charged with second-degree murder.
Right.
Bond was immediately revoked. Cuffs went on, and she's sitting behind bars right now waiting for sentencing, and we don't know when that's going to be. So I want to play her testimony because it's always a tricky thing when you take the stand. My personal opinion is if you can answer the questions that don't make sense to the average person, meaning the jury, like what's not lining up, if you can go and explain that and you have this aha moment, I think you have a chance with a jury. Otherwise, it's stacked against you.
It's always a risk. I mean, we know just from watching cops over the years, anything you say can and will be used against you. That's just not in the arrest process. Clearly, that's at trial. You say something the wrong way, even if ultimately it wasn't something that just objectively or on its face is something that is, inculpable. But then the way the readback is done, either by the court reporter or the way that it's taken in by the jury, it can have a damning effect where you maybe never even thought about that potential concept or that potential phrase. It's always a risk taking the stand. It's always one of the most anxiety-inducing things for me when my client's on the stand, no matter how long we've prepped, no matter how comfortable I feel that they can answer those aha moments. It's a calculated risk. But there are some times where even though the defendant never has the burden, there are cases where, look, we're going to need to know why he was shot in the back. And, that's a fact really kind of only you can clear up. Even though you're not required to testify, I think this is one of the cases where you got to put her on.
And she did. She took the stand. We got this video from Court TV. This is the pool feed. And here she is, Ashley, describing how he lunged at her.
He lunged at me, and I started pulling the trigger. And he just kept coming. And I remember trying to move to get away from him, but he kept coming at me.
What sticks out for me is, she's a petite woman, and just her shoulders are hunched forward, and she's just trembling there on the stand. They didn't believe her. I think also what did her in is when it was the prosecution's turn to question her, they asked her to reenact how the shooting went down.
Which was a risk on their part. I mean, just to be frank, you think all the way back to when you are either side, whether you're the defense or the prosecution, you start having witnesses do things live. Let's think about just going all the way back to OJ, right, with the trying on the gloves. That's always a risk in and of itself, too, because if she's able to perform in a way that is reasonably, I could see how that could happen. Now, whereas maybe the jury had been leaning toward guilt, they see maybe how questions they had about the angle of the shot or, how it could have been self-defense. If it makes sense, that's a risk that the prosecution took, but it's one that I guess clearly paid off.
Yeah. Let's talk about them, their marriage and their meeting, which I find very interesting, and then we're going to kind of work our way back to the trial again. So they married within 13 days of meeting each other. That, to me, sounds pretty risky. Just, that would be my advice to my son.
Euphemistically, it's risky.
It's a little risky. It certainly sounds romantic, right? And it is possible that it can happen, but it just seems like too much when you factor in a bunch of things. Think about it. All right, so it's 2016. They meet at a political fundraiser in swanky Palm Beach. Doug is a widower. His wife, his long-term partner, his wife has passed away just 9 months earlier. So he's still in the grieving process, right? He's got a teenage daughter. And he meets this woman, 24-year-old swimsuit model, former ballerina. And 13 days later, not only are they married, but he is buying and creating from scratch a ballet company for her in Charleston, which is not cheap.
You said something where it's like it could be romantic. I guess maybe at some other point in time, but in 2024, with what we know about marriages, with what we know about the divorce rates, just the way relationships go these days, I can't really ascribe to that. I would say more it's kind of strange. This day and age, it rings of, I know he was widowed, right? So maybe he's just not in the right place. Mm-hmm. He's sad. He's lonely. He's desperate. To me, it's coming from like a place of more negative emotion than anything positive, right? And I think, again, if I'm the defense, that's also something might be threaded into kind of how we're presenting, right? Like, and maybe to the extent that they're not working out and she's trying to pull away from him, some of the child custody related issues. He clearly has the anger issues with the shooting into the ceiling. Maybe would have tried to play that up a little bit more. But, I mean, hey, they got married after 13 days. What are you going to do?
Wow. And it was, quite a roller coaster after that. So not everyone was happy with this romance, particularly his daughter, Eva, who at the time was 16. Eva was very suspicious of this ballerina who had twirled her way into Dad's life for a lot of reasons. So, while Dad maybe was working on grieving his way, the daughter was seriously grieving. She said on TikTok, she goes by Eva B on TikTok, and she said on TikTok that her dad promised her that he wouldn't be remarrying anytime soon. And so from the time he met Ashley until they married was 13 days. That's not a lot of time to get your teenager accustomed to what's about to happen.
Yeah, that's beyond soon. I mean,
right? In all fairness to her, I mean, the whole thing is horrific. I want you to listen to Eva in her own words from her TikTok account.
From the age of 15, when I found my mother dead on the floor, up until now, I'm 23, I've dealt with a lot of traumatic, scary shit. My dad and Ashley's relationship, him getting killed when I was 19, being on my own when I was 19, having no financial support when I was 19. I started a clothing brand, and now at 23, I'm having to sue someone over said clothing brand. And now I'm dealing with this trial.
When she says, I find my mom dead when I'm 15 years old, and then my father is shot when I'm 19, and I'm only 23 years old, I can't even imagine what she's been through.
You can tell just even in her disposition, right? Like she's now, like the phrase like an old soul. I don't know what she was like before, but there's just like an energy, like a gravitas to her, like that, like life is hit. You know what I mean? And she just sounds so mature. It's like she just sounds a little well beyond her years. You know what I mean? But it's because she's experienced a lot of trauma in her short life, And
what really bothers me is that she shares how people on TikTok have been so mean and critical of her. And that just really bothers me because she's a young person, and I don't know at what age you can handle your mom dying or your dad being shot dead, and now you're asking.
I don't think there's an age for that.
Right?
That's ever something that would be okay.
And now you're 19 and both your parents are gone and your dad has been shot dead by police, say your stepmom. Who's
a few years older than you at that. I feel for her. Like when you and I were talking about some of the comments that were, levied toward her, people calling her a POS. It's like, look, I get the internet haters are out there. They love to watch these kinds of things and vent their own insecurities or their own issues. But come on, like have a filter. Like everything this girl's been through, regardless of maybe even how I feel about was it the strongest legal case or what have you, in terms of like what she's gone through, that's objectively not okay. And then to come at her like that, come on.
No, she's a survivor of a crime. She has been severely impacted, and I just, there's no place for that. So let's get back to the case. Clearly, Eva, the daughter, is not having it, doesn't like the new stepmom moving in. And it was kind of tough at the time because I guess Eva also had a friend of hers move in at the house in Charleston. So a lot of people in the house there. There's talk about this argument where Doug became so upset that he pulled out a gun and he blasted at the ceiling of their home in Charleston. And then Doug later told a friend, he said, quote, "It's the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life." But what exactly got him to that point, we don't really know. Look, I think it's entirely possible, as you think, that Ashley may very well have been. There could have been issues of control and abuse. There could have been a lot.
Volatility.
Volatility. There could have been. I mean, you don't know who you're marrying if you're marrying them 13 days after you said, hello, my name is Ashley.
And I've been with my wife for 13 years. There are still things that will pop up, be like, oh, okay, right? But like within 13 days, to think that you know someone well enough, I think objectively we can just say, like, you can't.
Yeah.
You can't.
No, and Doug didn't know what he was getting. It's quite simple. Okay, so he has a background in the military. He also was a technology consultant, an entrepreneur. He had launched a bunch of businesses. And like I said, the big project for his new bride, his gift, his wedding gift to her, was something called the American National Ballet based in Charleston. Look, we all know that the live arts, the performing arts, are seriously having trouble with funding and getting people to support them.
Right.
So this had to have been, that's quite a gift. I am giving you your dream, a ballet company for a former ballerina.
Yeah, I mean, there's barely any performing arts in, the school systems these days and everything like that. And I hear you.
So they're working on launching this ballet company. And then in the summer of 2017, Ashley gets pregnant. And she's having a terrible time with the pregnancy, feeling very ill. Even the stepdaughter, Eva, said on TikTok that she was very, very ill at the time. So she has no interest in the ballet company right now. She doesn't feel well. She wants to go move back with her mom. I guess she wants to go back down to Florida to be with mom. Now, Doug is stuck with a ballet company that he doesn't know what to do with, and he's still trying to raise money for it. That whole thing collapses. The marriage is collapsing at the same time. And at this point, Ashley is expressing to friends and family that she doesn't want to be with Doug. He's too controlling, too volatile, and she's safer by herself with her mom. Doug is trying to figure out what's going on. Let's fast forward. We're now in September of 2017, so that was the summer. Now it's September.
Okay.
And Ashley has decided she wants nothing to do with Doug. She's gone back up to the Charleston house to get her stuff. He's apparently helping her move stuff. Okay, she leaves him a note. This is, instead of Dear John, it's Dear Doug. Mm-hmm. Okay. She calls him controlling, claiming his behavior made her fearful for her life and the safety of their unborn child. Mm-hmm. Ashley accused him of trying to poison her, of questioning whether he may have had a hand in his wife's death, which has not come up. Also in the note.
And certainly shouldn't have for the purposes of any trial or anything like that, but certainly should not have.
But this was her angry note.
Right.
Here's the other part of that note. Do not harass or try to follow me. I will talk to you only via text starting Tuesday, September 19th. And she ended her note with, thanks for your understanding. That's the part. Thanks for your What is this? A business memo to the person in the cubicle next to you?
Thank you for understanding. You know what people say? Like when you're done, yeah. Right? And that's more what that reads to me. It's just someone that she's done.
Yeah. Eva, the daughter, said on TikTok when she saw her father read that note, she saw him so upset that the only other time she saw him that upset was at her mother's funeral. So he was devastated, without question, devastated. All right. 6 months later, Ashley finally gives birth to a daughter in March of 2018. Now, Doug's side of the family is saying Doug didn't find out about the birth of the baby until 1 month later.
Right.
So, one could see where she could have texted. If she said we can only communicate via text, you can't say the baby.
No, seriously, if you're trying to keep everything clear for the record and you've kind of moved to that place of the post-relationship, and you have a child together now, that would be expected at least.
Yeah, I think so too. So legal battle is going on, and that continued until Doug's death, and they were now fighting for custody of the baby. She wanted to keep the baby. Doug wanted the right just to see her, and that's what they, this was going back and forth. Then Ashley filed multiple domestic violence complaints. However, they were all closed and no charges were filed. Now, I'm always very careful not to read too much into that because I have seen in the system where victims of domestic violence have repeatedly gone to the authorities and been denied, and then they're found dead, and then all of a sudden someone's realizing maybe someone should have listened.
You and I have literally talked about cases like that. When I've been here on the show, I've seen it professionally. I mean, we know it happens. It happens. So yeah, you can't read and take too much stock from it. But again, it's something that like she proactively is like trying to make that record, right? Like she's trying to be clear. There's an issue here. She's reaching out to the authorities. These are the kinds of things I was just saying, like, no matter what may have happened with respect to how the shooting happened, the angle of the shot or what have you, there is a history there that I think could support her narrative. It wasn't bought, but I think you give that to any other jury, I can't say that it would be the same exact decision that we came back with here.
Yeah. It's interesting because I have seen in Florida where a woman took the stand in her defense and told the jury about years and years and years of grooming. And when the whole history was, it was unbelievable. The jury found her not guilty.
Yeah, and then think about it also, too. We're talking about, like, Florida, stand your ground. There was a hearing in this matter, of course, which, defendants in Florida that are kind of in her situation that are claiming self-defense, you get kind of like a pretrial hearing regarding whether or not the state would even be permitted to move forward on a homicide charge, because to the extent that you had the right to stand your ground, no case, dismissed. But even the fact that hearing, which probably set the stage for maybe this won't go her way, right? The judge in Florida found that, like, no, on these facts, I can't hold that, like, stand your ground is going to protect you, sends her to trial. But I'm just saying, like, these are all the layers that are involved in this case that I don't in any way think made it a slam dunk for the prosecution. But it certainly was a tough case for the defense as well. Toss up in my mind. And this is just what we're dealing with in terms of the verdict.
Yeah, it was surprising. I mean, I didn't know which way it was going to go. Nobody really ever does. But what I was taking into account was that Ashley had a small but strong group of supporters in Florida who would show up at the courthouse every day protesting. Mm-hmm. And in the middle of this whole thing is her daughter, who was 6 years old, holding up a sign in defense of her mom.
That's tough.
And I thought that was really powerful. Whether or not the jurors are allowed to see that as they enter the courtroom, I don't know. I have no idea if they would have been exposed to that. But it just made me think, okay, so clearly she has people in her life who support her, who believe her, who may very well have witnessed what she was talking about. So that's why I wasn't so sure how this was going to go. She definitely had a lot of support. Then there was an incident. This one is just so bizarre. This is when he is helping Ashley load a U-Haul truck with her stuff so she can get all her belongings. And they get into an argument because he gets mad that she's telling him how to load the truck and that he's loading the truck all wrong. And then he says it's time, like, you should start acting like a wife. And then, bam, it just explodes.
Yeah. I mean, literally.
Yeah. It just sounds very controlling. It's like arguing about how to load the truck. Look, she's clearly not happy with him. So, she needs her truck loaded her way. He's not loading it the way it just shows to me it's in those simplest of things where, like, you're like, it's your nerve ending is raw.
You know what they always say, like in couples counseling and stuff like that. It's the fight isn't about the order of items that are being put in the U-Haul. There's clearly a lot of underlying unresolved resentment, that's existing, and it's just coming out in that moment, right? And like that's the trigger that can just blow it up.
Yeah. So let's move on to the point at which 911 is called in. It's September 27th of 2020. Manatee County gets a call from 911, not from Ashley, but from a neighbor. Ashley is run to his house, and she's frantic, and she's yelling and calling for help. And she said Doug attacked her and that she shot at him. So from the very first moment, I always think of the 911 call as the very first police report. She's owning up to having shot him. Mm-hmm. Do you think at all it was potentially premeditated, more heat of the moment? I mean, I realize the jury has already ruled. I'm just, the fact that she didn't try to cover it up.
Yeah, I mean, look, the timing, the reason why I can't go too deep into it is because, sometimes people do, right? Like, and
Yeah.
you don't know the timing between when whatever happened and when she runs over to the neighbor's house. But what I will say, and this is where I think you and I are in line, like, at least from the inception, consistency. Not trying to, like, cover it up at the outset, or he fell on the gun, or he tried to, like, none of that stuff, right? So from the outset, like, she's telling the story that she tried to tell on the stand.
Yeah. Right. And she said she was scared, and she may very well have been.
Right. And I think based on the history we've discussed, the domestic violence reports, some of this other objective stuff, I'm not going to sit up here and say that she wasn't.
Yeah, we just really don't know. We really don't. So when the emergency personnel arrive, Doug is in Ashley's bedroom, and he is still alive, but he's unable to speak. If only Doug could have told the responders what had happened.
Yeah, or said something.
Yeah, right? So Doug is rushed to the local hospital where he later died. He was shot both in the leg and in the chest. And here, as we said earlier, the medical examiner determined that Doug was not directly facing Ashley at the time of the shooting. So that, to me, was the most damning thing.
That's our worst fact. That's our worst fact. I'm sitting down with her, like, I'm just saying hypothetically, we're having the discussion about the case. When you do this kind of work in the defense realm, you get the discovery from the prosecution, you start going through it with your client, and you're working through, like, what are our bad facts? Like, you're really starting with that. Like, what are the bad facts that we're going to have to deal with that aren't going to go away, and that we need to either figure out how to attack, or to the extent that we can't, maybe we need to start having a discussion about a plea, right? That's bad fact number one, and it was the biggest bad fact, I think.
Would you have encouraged her to take a plea on this one?
We would have had conversations about it because of the risk, right? I mean, she's looking at now a mandatory minimum of 11 and a half years. I don't know if the prosecutor, and I'm not saying this happened, but if you're asking for my calculus, like, if someone puts 2 or 3 years in front of her on a manslaughter charge, do we need to have that conversation? Yes. There are certain times where the prosecution will call, they'll give you some crazy number, and it's just like, I'm going to tell my client about that, but we're not going to talk about it for long. We're going to keep prepping for trial. They would have thrown like 2 or 3 years out. Me and her have to have a serious talk because of the risk of where we are now, particularly on that bad fact.
Wow. So 6 weeks after the shooting, this would have been now November 4th of 2020, that's when the authorities arrested Ashley. So they took time to evaluate everything. It was interesting to me, it wasn't immediately taken into custody, and she was charged with second-degree murder. She was able to post her bond. That was not difficult for her. So she was allowed to be free ahead of trial, but had to have a curfew and an ankle monitor. Not too unusual, not a flight risk, has a young child. Totally get that.
No crazy violent history. I mean, yeah, those are typical conditions that you'll see, even on a case like this.
Right. February 2023, that's when Ashley tried to get the charges against her dropped because they had the stand your ground hearing. And the judge ruled that this was just not justified. There was nothing about this that appeared to fit stand your ground. And I kind of feel that Florida...
I know what you're about to say. I know what you're about to say because we talked about it, but go ahead.
My observation is that when it comes to stand your ground, the courts in Florida really do tend to side with the person charged.
Yeah, they err on the side of, like, the person with the gun. I mean, they give broad protection with respect to that particular provision of law. Like, we've seen it. We've seen cases where it's like, are you serious? We talked about some of the cases. So on this one, again, if down there they're coming back with, on the law, I have to send this case to trial, it's just not enough to invoke this provision of law to dismiss the charges. Yeah, that's the other part about, like, if the prosecution comes to me with like a 2 or a 3 year type of situation, I need to speak with her, especially if the judge has already determined that, that law is not going to protect you.
Yeah, that I think was incredibly telling. So, I've talked about Ashley's supporters outside. I'm so touched. It's a lot to see a little girl, her name is Emerson, who's 6 years old, holding up her sign because her mommy is charged with murdering her daddy.
And her half-sister, I mean, you just think about like the trauma they've had to deal with in their lives. You know what I mean? It's
Right?
insane because now like she's losing her mother for at least 11 and a half years, barring some kind of appeal or something like that. I mean, her sister lost her mother. They both lost their father. Ugh,
Yeah.
goodness.
I hope that somewhere in there is a healing for these two, and I don't know if they'll ever be allowed to heal with each other, because I believe that the little girl is with her maternal grandmother, because that's where Ashley fled when she wanted to get away from Doug and was pregnant. So,
Hopefully they let them have a relationship, right? Like even if she's with maternal grandma, like because yeah, who else you gonna have to support in any way start to understand maybe a scintilla of what you're dealing with? They've dealt with a lot, man.
only
To be
those
so
two
young.
know.
Yeah.
Only those two know, and I hope that something, happens for them. So all that's going on outside. Back into the courtroom, we've discussed the defense was battered spouse syndrome. So to validate her claims of abuse, Ashley not only took the stand, but then she submitted some text messages. She said that Doug had admitted to punching their dog and shooting a gun in the home. And in one of those text messages, there was a quote. "I shot the gun. How many times did I tell you I was having, a nervous breakdown?" I just, punching the dog, don't even get me there.
I know that. I've known you for a while. Yeah, we're not going to start with that with you.
Yeah. So the fact that it's in a text message and he's owning up to some of this bad behavior, but not enough, I guess, for the jury.
Yeah, but it's just I'm giving the defense credit. Like that's the way you want to play out the narrative in terms of like painting who he is, right? And like I don't want to say that again, like you're ever responsible necessarily for your own death. I mean, some people frankly are. This case being more of a toss-up, they're at least putting out a compelling enough narrative where if the prosecution has to meet their burden beyond a reasonable doubt, here's some doubt, right,
Yeah.
in regards to the prosecution's case and a little bit more credit toward ours when we're saying why she was afraid and why she's been afraid of this man. He's over here punching dogs. He's shooting, holes into walls, getting upset, like when we're having, minuscule arguments about, moving or what have you. These are the kinds of things that you want to put out there. I think the defense effectively did it. They just didn't get the verdict they were looking for.
Yeah. I think also that moment, again, when the prosecutors made her do a step-by-step demonstration of how she shot him, where was Doug, and all of that, I don't think that helped at all. I
wonder if they were even prepared for that. Like, I don't know enough about, like, the super nuance of the case, but I wonder maybe if the prosecution had to put a motion together for the judge to consider that request or, like, you know what I mean? Like, just so that they could have prepared for it, right?
Do
like,
they
the
have
defense
to?
could
I
have
mean,
prepared
can't
for
the prosecution just say, okay, show me where he was and show me where you were standing? Like, why do I have to, like, get permission or tell the court about that? I'm just curious, just for legal reasons.
I mean, I'm definitely objecting to it, just on the right. I'm objecting just on the grounds of, relevance, right? In terms of, is it prejudicial? Like, I'm going down the rules of evidence, right? And so I'm just wondering if, in anticipation of defense objections, if they maybe put the court and the defense on notice, like, hey, we're going to be asking her to do this. And if that was the case, did the defense prep her for that? I've had self-defense types of cases where I'm just like, look, when you're explaining this to the jury, for instance, there was a case I was dealing with where, the woman took the gun from her assailant, right, and turned it on her assailant, shot her assailant, right? And I'm just like, we've been through this, but you can't see that on the video. There was surveillance video, but you couldn't see her taking the gun. So I'm like, look, when you're explaining this, you're really going to have to go back in your head and remember exactly how you got that gun out of his hand in a way that's believable for the jury to believe that you as a woman were able to snatch a gun from a man that was about 6 or 7 inches taller than you, had more weight than you. You're going to have to break that down. She went back into her memory. She did a fantastic job, right? But in doing that, we talked through the mechanics, what it looked like, the logistics. I just wonder if the defense had the opportunity to do that here. You know what I mean? Because I don't know. Maybe they could have played it out better. I don't know. I didn't watch her whenever she was doing whatever she was doing in court. But like I said, that's always a risky proposition. One that you either want to be prepared for if you're the defense or a witness that's being asked to do that. And one you certainly want to take into account. Do we want to have this witness do this if you're the party that's requesting for the witness to, perform, essentially?
Well, the jury, of course, didn't buy any of this, and she was convicted, but of the lesser charge, down to conviction of manslaughter. So Eva, Doug's daughter, who has survived a lot, went on TikTok right after the verdict came in, and this is what she had to say.
We are walking to my car from the courthouse after waiting all afternoon to get a verdict, and she was convicted of manslaughter after 4 years of waiting. My dad got the justice that he deserves.
Clearly, Doug's daughter, Eva, is pleased with the conviction, feels that her dad got justice. But as you and I both know, even if she is sentenced to the max, Ashley is, the pain and the loss almost, I believe, intensifies in a different manner after trials are over, because now the survivors no longer have the focus or the distraction of the trial, but they are left with the pure emptiness of what has been taken from them. And I see that sadness all the time. I've seen them at executions. Families are like, they are partying, they're drinking champagne after the killer has been executed, especially a serial killer, and you have all these families in a parking lot, and they're like, yeah, right? Finally, their moment, and they've been waiting decades for this moment. And I'll never forget, because I was staying at the same hotel as the family members. And the next morning, I seen them at breakfast, and they are all just empty and dejected and exhausted and sad. Because once that's gone, you're still left with the emptiness. To me, it was an incredible moment of learning about people, about loss, and how trials fill that emptiness and distract you for a time, but not always.
Super illustrative. The only thing I could think is, sometimes we discuss like the 5 stages of grief. Well, what's the last stage? The acceptance, right? And I think, problem in these kinds of situations with the trials, or you're waiting for someone to be executed, what it's doing is like giving you that last bit of focus before you have to get to the acceptance stage, right? Because it's like, we need this taken care of. We need the retribution. Like, we need whatever it is that you need out of whatever's going to happen from a retributive side of things. And then ultimately, once that happens, you're not looking forward to that anymore. You're not focused on that. You're not worried about is the appeal going to win? Is he right? Like, all of that stuff is over. Now you have to hit stage 5, and that's probably what you've seen. You've seen day 1 of starting to get through stage 5.
It is so painful to see, because the emotions are so raw, and the sadness and the loss is so profound that it's physical. You can see it. It is a horrible thing to watch. Wow. Well, once we find out what happens at sentencing, I'll be very, very curious to hear some of the impact statements. I'm sure Eva is going to have a lot to say about what happens to Ashley and what she asks the judge to consider. It'll be very interesting to see Ashley's mother and defenders and what they ask the judge in the form of mercy here. I think that will be very telling.
Yeah. And even where Eva's at that point, because remember we were talking earlier about the dynamic between these two sisters, right? And so it's I guess where Eva is okay, this is the verdict we've been looking for. Clearly for Emerson, it's no, my mom's going away for the next 11 and a half, at least, years, right? And just how that can play into the dynamic between those two moving forward, real tough.
Really tough, really tough. Well, Phillip, it's always such a pleasure. Even more of a pleasure to have you here in person in the flesh.
Just come back to New York.
All right.
Just come back.
Okay. Well, I am going to be spending more time here because we've got a new TV show coming out, True Crime News, launching September 9th. Not that I'm plugging. In fact, I was here today doing extra and a few other meetings.
Good.
So, yeah, I'll be spending a little bit more time, but we will be based out of California. And from here, I'm actually headed on assignment to a horrific case, to a horrific murder in the South that has broken my heart and broken the hearts of many. So, yeah.
Well, I never knew you were a Queens girl until we had that conversation a little while back. So I'm just saying. And then we come to find out that basically you're growing up in the town that's right over from, me and my father's town. So it's
How crazy is that?
Small
I
world.
just can't believe you didn't pick up on the Queen's attitude.
Look, where you're from in Queens has like its own specific kind of vague attitude. So yeah, I didn't pick up on it directly. But like I'm saying, just, come back. You do this more often.
Yeah, I would love that. Okay, Phillip, where can people find you and follow you?
Well, 48 Wall Street. That's the office right down the block. And then, of course, on social media, you can find me pretty much across all platforms at ESQ Hamilton. At ESQ Hamilton.
All right. And I'm Ana G News, Anna with one N. You can find everything you need for all our social media platforms at My True Crime News. We've really made that simple now. You can find this podcast, all our podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, which has more than 5 million subscribers. You can always subscribe to our newsletter at True Crime News. All right. So until next week, this is True Crime News, the podcast. I'm your host, Ana Garcia. And as we always say, don't do crime.